점수 잡는 hackers.
So, as always, we start from the question. Something to remember about big picture fact problems is that you're always focused on the overall structure of the passage. So in order to understand what the main purpose of that given text is, you first of all would have to understand what the topic is. And what is topic? Topic is the most repeated word or phrase within a given range. Once you understand what the subject is, the topic is, then you can find the right tone that's being ascribed to that topic. And then finally you arrive at a sort of main idea or the main purpose of the text. Okay, so why don't we start from the beginning? Conventional wisdom. So these two words should signal something. Because whenever we start by something that's conventional or a long-held belief, then you are to expect that something would change along the line. Long held that the first people to reach the Americas crossed via an ancient land bridge between Siberia and Alaska and had to wait until two huge ice sheets that cover what is now Canada started to recede, creating an ice-free corridor, which enabled them to move south. So far what we have read so far indicates that the first people that came to the Americas had to wait until the glaciers completely receded and created an ice-free corridor before they could move south. Okay, so how would that change? Because in the second sentence, we're being provided with a new study, in a new study. So a conventional wisdom in a new study would have to have some sort of a differing element or something that contradicts one another. If it's not contradicting one another, then at least it would be an amendment or adjustment to the previous belief. Okay, so what does this person do? E.W. and colleagues used ancient DNA extracted from this corridor, okay, to investigate how its ecosystem evolved as the glaciers began to retreat. And it continues. They created a comprehensive picture showing how and when different flora and fauna emerged. So this is what they have studied, specifically focused on. And the once ice-covered landscape became a viable passageway. So this new study is providing evidence that indicates that the ice-covered landscape was actually a viable passage. So we are to look for the main idea. So first of all, before we even examine the answer choice, we need to have a firm idea as to what should be the right element to be included in the right answer choice. And that would be the topic itself, which is how people came to the Americas. Okay? And we're given the conventional wisdom and the result of a new study, the evidence provided by a new study. So keep that in mind. So first answer choice, to evaluate and establish theory about ice age flora and fauna in America. It seems to go on a right track at first, but it talks about ice age flora and fauna. Ice age flora and fauna is mentioned in the passage, but is that the right topic to be focused on? No. So we call this an off-topic element. What about B? To describe evidence showing how people came to populate the Americas. So how people came to the Americas is right on the topic, and also describing evidence would properly describe the evidence that we just read about in the new study. What about C? So this is the best candidate so far. Let's examine the rest before we finalize the answer. To discuss the development of a historically important ecosystem for the earliest humans. Okay, so an important ecosystem, and an ecosystem at least, was mentioned in the new study, but that being historically important would be an off-topic element, and also the topic gets out of track at the last part of the answer choice because the passage does not talk about earliest humans. Remember, it talks about how people came to populate the Americas. Okay, so we have also an off-topic element in this answer choice. Okay, the last one. This is where students actually gets tricked a lot, and the last answer choice says to explain how scientists know that the ice-free corridor hypothesis is correct. But remember, the ice-free corridor hypothesis was the initial hypothesis which the new study sheds a new light on. So knowing how this is correct would actually contradict the tone of the passage as well as the information. So this would be both off tone and a contradiction. Okay, so the final answer would be B, which checks out on all fronts. It matches the right topic and also talks about the right evidence that's being discussed at the second half of the passage. Okay, so for every problem, we're always going to talk about the filters that could be applied to disqualify each answer choice. But in the actual test, you may have a very specific idea as to what the right answer should be, and there may be no need for you to eliminate every answer choice. But for the explanation, to explain each problem by talking about every possibility, I will be eliminating answer choices. Okay. So we have another big picture fact problem, and as always, we start from the question. Which choice best describes the function of the underlying sentence in the text as a whole? Okay, so this is the part of the question that indicates a big picture problem, and the function is simply asking you the structure of the entire text. So we're only focused on facts, so not straying from the explicitly written information in the text is very important. So why don't we start from the beginning? In 2019, a team of researchers led by Justin C. explored a new way to alert healthcare providers to cardiac arrest in patients. Okay, so we're talking about a new way. This may be our potential topic. The study utilized smartphones and smart speakers to detect a disordered breathing pattern known as agonal breathing that occurs just prior to arrest in about half of all cases. So before someone has a heart attack, this device alerts the healthcare personnel about the impending heart attack. So if the smart device identifies agonal breathing, the irregular breathing pattern, while the patient sleeps, it contacts paramedics. This method, so now it becomes evident that the new way or the device or the method is certainly our topic for this particular text. Does not require the patient to wear a device while sleeping and has a low rate of false positive results. So this is an important piece of information to remember. So it's very low in terms of the possibility of making mistakes. It's very, very accurate. However, so now we come to the underlying portion. However, the passage pivots. It would only catch about 50% of cardiac arrest incidents, meaning that it would only notice or alert about 50% of heart attacks as, and here's the reason, as agonal breathing, something that this device detects does not precede all heart attacks. So the irregular pattern of breathing does not always come before every heart attack. So despite it being accurate and has a very low chance of false identification, it still only catches about 50% of all the heart attacks. So remember, because we're mainly considered with the function of the underlying portion in the entire text, we need to first of all understand what this underlying portion signals. It signals the limitation or the possible drawbacks of the system or the method. So keep that in mind. All right. So A, it enumerates potential errors in the technology that is described in the text. The technology is properly described as it focuses on the right topic, but what about the word errors? Okay, it enumerates potential errors. Remember that the system or the method has a very low rate of making errors. So this would actually contradict the passage. On top of that, enumerating indicates listing things in a number or an order. So first, second, and third. You don't see any of that structure in the text. So this also gets crossed out as something that wasn't mentioned in the text. What about B? It identifies factors that the system described in the text had previously failed to consider. So you're going to see a lot of this kind of answer choice as a trick answer choice because it leads students to infer something that's not actually in the passage. So do we know that these people have previously failed to consider the factors? It does identify a factor, right? And it talks about the system, okay? But whether if they had previously fail to consider this or not cannot be decided by the text. So if you have thought, well, if it's making this type of error, why couldn't they predict it in the first place? If this was your thought, then that's something that should not enter your mind in choosing the right answer choice. So this would be a typical example of an inference trap. So keep this in mind. What about C? It acknowledges the limitations of the system. Okay, so that's the right topic. Limitation is a proper description of the underlying portion, and acknowledging would be the proper structure of the text, because it generally talks about its accuracy, how it's a new system that could potentially be useful, but the last portion simply describes how it only catches about 50%. So this is a best candidate so far. And the last one, it proposes a solution. This is where it gets disqualified, right? Solution for a problem mentioned earlier in the text. So we don't see anything about a solution, so this would be an off-topic element. So our final answer, answer choice C. Just be aware of the inference trap, okay? And also something that contradicts the passage. Now we move on to big picture fact problems, and we always start by looking at the question stem. Which choice best states the main purpose? Some of the exchangeable terms would be main idea and overall structure. And we need to consider the entirety of what is being provided. Okay, so let's start with the first verse. The title is I Sing the Body Electric. The circling rivers, the breath, and breathing in and out. Remember that the active breathing is being now compared to circling rivers, in and out. And second verse, the beauty of the waist. Because this word indicates the tone, you need to note this while understanding this verse. The beauty of the waist and thence of the hips. Now you can be certain that this poem, it starts by describing parts of the body. And the tone ascribed to those parts of the body, usually positive. So circling rivers, the breath, the beauty of the waist, and thence the hips of the hips, and thence downward towards the knees. The thin red jellies within you or within me. This would be a reference to a person's blood. The bones and the marrow in the bones. So now the focus is more towards the inside of the body, but it still stays on the subject of a person's body. The exquisite, this is another tone indication, which is very positive, the exquisite realization of health. And last two verses repeats a pattern. Oh, I say, and oh, I say, these are not parts and poems of the body only. So that's where it's very explicit. The writer says it's not just parts and poems of the body, but only, but of the soul. And then it repeats, oh, I say, now these are the soul. So the poem starts by describing the parts of the body and moves inside a person's body to describe how exquisite and how it provides the sense of health. But at the last two verses, it clearly states that this is not just a poem about the body, but of the soul. So in the last verse, the author equates the body with the soul. So what is the main purpose? What is the purpose of this poem being written? You have to remember, whatever you pick, it should describe the body and the soul being equated. Okay. To celebrate the full restoration of health after an illness. Of course, health is mentioned in the poem, but does that have the right tone or the right description? The full restoration. Restoration is the act of being restored or being recovered after an illness. And this word restoration and illness has no basis in the text. What about B? To compare the relative importance of various parts of the body. Parts of the body is definitely the subject of the poem, but does it compare the relative importance? It doesn't, right? So this comparison would be the reason why answer choice B gets eliminated. So restoration, off topic, comparison, also off topic, something you cannot find within the poem. To eliminate the distinction between matter and spirit. At first sight, this answer choice may seem off topic, but matter is signified by the parts of the body, and also the spirit is signified by the word soul. And does the offer eliminate the distinction between the two? It certainly does. Why? Because at the last two verses, let's see this again, it's not only but of the soul. So it's not the parts and poems of the body only, but of the soul. So that's where it eliminates the distinction. So answer choice C is the best candidate we have so far. So let's finish it off with answer choice D. To pay tribute to a beloved soul who has departed from this world. The word soul is in here, but what does it mean to say that a soul has departed this world? Someone who has died. Is there a tribute to someone who has passed away? No. If you don't remember seeing that in terms of wording or action or context, then you can cross out this also as an off-topic element. Okay, so that's our first big picture fact problem, and let's examine the next one. Okay, as always, we start with the question, main purpose. And now the passage type's a little different. In 2011, a group of physicists in Italy cloaked a subatomic particle called a neutrino. A neutrino, you don't have to know what it is. It says it's a subatomic particle. And reported that its speed is 0.002% faster than that of light. If true, the achievement would disprove a principle. So if it is true, it would disprove a principle of Albert Einstein's relative theory stating that light is the fastest traveler in the universe. So if this initial finding were to be true, then the initial theory, the Einstein's theory of relativity, saying that light is the fastest traveling object, would be proven wrong. But what happened? But do they really violate Einstein's speed limit? First proposed in 1905, the Italian physicists subsequently attributed their controversial finding to an error. Okay, so now we can see that the first sentence has been proven to be wrong, and numerous studies have confirmed that neutrinos, okay, so we see this word again, which have just 1/1,000,000th of the mass of an electron, are nevertheless too heavy to exceed the speed of light. And this really puts the nail in the coffin. So what has been proposed initially has been proven wrong. So can we formulate an answer in our head? So whatever we pick should talk about neutrinos, because that's obviously the topic of this entire text. Neutrino was proposed to have a speed exceeding light, but it had been disconfirmed. So we need to find that message within the answer choice. Let's look at the first one. To report the results of a study that proved neutrinos were faster than light. So it has the right topic. But is the result correct? A study that proved neutrinos moved faster than light. It proved nothing. It says it was due to an error, right? So this contradicts the passage. What about B? To examine new evidence that subatomic particles now travel faster than they once did. Of course, neutrinos are subatomic particles, but this doesn't really capture the topic well. And it says it now travels faster than they once did, meaning that before it was slower, now it's faster. Now traveling faster can have no support from the passage, so it's also an off-topic element. What about C? To explore the possibility that neutrinos break the long-accepted law of the cosmos. The law of the cosmos can be referred to as the theory of relativity, and it has the right topic, and the passage certainly explores the possibility. It's the strongest candidate so far. What about the last one? Does it capture the right topic? To draw attention to the research that invalidates a foundational theory in physics. So the foundational theory in physics can also find its reference to relativity, the theory of relativity, but to draw attention to research that invalidates would be a contradiction. It was proven to be wrong. So the only answer choice that properly describes the topic and also the right message would be answer choice C. If you were to eliminate other answer choices, the first thing to look at would be the topic, and the only one that's on topic would be answer choice A and C. That's another way to approach this problem. We move on to another big picture fact problem, and the question appears at the bottom. Which choice most effectively used data from the table that supports the researcher's conclusion? Okay, so the first thing to do is to find a conclusion from the text and integrate that information to what is in the data set. Okay, so first things first, we need to find what the conclusion is. Facebook is the largest online social network in the world with more than 2 billion global users. Its popularity is clear indication that users value the service. So it's popular, and it seems like it seems that users also value this service. It's popular, and it seems to be valuable. However, this value is difficult to measure since the company does not charge users any fee. Because it's free, we cannot really measure the value, making it unclear what they would be willing to pay for use of the service to arrive at such a value. So in order to figure out what kind of value people put on Facebook, JRC and colleagues held an experiment with college students in which the students were asked to say how much money they would be willing to accept. Okay, so in exchange to not using Facebook, how much money are people willing to accept? So this would put an exact value on using Facebook in exchange for spending time off Facebook for a period of time. Based on the results, the researchers concluded. Okay, so the word we were looking for comes at the last part of the passage. What they have concluded is here, that users placed a high value on Facebook. Okay, so before we examine the data set, we need to look for a piece of information. Remember that the data set may not always agree with what's concluded in the passage, but we need to look for a data set that supports the fact that people put a high value on Facebook. Okay, so let's move on. Don't skip the titles. Always read the title to see what is being discussed in the data set. And it says amount of participants were willing to accept. Okay, so this is what was mentioned in the passage for time off Facebook, and it is expressed in terms of dollars. And we can see that the duration of which people are willing to stay off Facebook, the mean, the average, the minimum, and the maximum. Okay, let's first of all identify what kind of data that we are willing to use to support, to strengthen the conclusion in the passage. The minimum obviously wouldn't be used because if, as you see, the minimum value is $0. So no, the fact that some people are not willing to accept any money for taking some time off Facebook wouldn't really support the conclusion in the text. Maximum can support the value people put on Facebook, but compared to mean, the average, this would actually serve as sort of an outlier, something that is off the average. So keeping that in mind, we are to identify an answer choice that describes the value of value that people put on not using Facebook. Okay, so let's start from answer choice A. Some of the users were willing to accept no money to stay off Facebook. And this is the kind of answer choice that we need to look out for, because this describes the data correctly, but accepting no money doesn't support the conclusion that people put value on Facebook. What about B? The amount of 3 days is over twice the amount for 1 day. So if the amount is twice the amount for 1 day, it certainly describes the value, but we need to make sure if it actually describes the data correctly. So is 3 days, is 3 days more than a day, more than twice? And it certainly is, right? 6 and 15. What about C? The dollar amount increased for every corresponding increase in time. So if the dollar amount increased, then that certainly proves that people put a lot of value on Facebook. So B and C are contenders for the right answer. And let's examine D. Users needed at least $15,000 to stay off Facebook for 7 days. Is it at least? We see that the maximum is $1,500, but it wouldn't be at least. So D contradicts the data. So a wrong answer choice would either contradict the data or the conclusion in the passage. What we're looking for is something that supports both. And we have 2 answer choices. These 2 answer choices both support the data set and the conclusion in the text. But in order to pick, and let's find, the one that most effectively uses the data to support the conclusion, we need to consider the sample size. 1 day and 3 days is part of the data set, but which answer choice can most strengthen the conclusion, the one that incorporates all the data set that shows that people put value on Facebook. And that answer choice would not be B, but C. So this is something to review because some answer choices, that could be 2 or 3, could actually support both data and the conclusion, but you'd have to further consider which one of the 2 or 3 actually supports the conclusion the most, and that has to do with the sample size. Okay, let's consider another one. It's also a big picture fact problem, and starting with the question, it's the same type of problem. Which choice most effectively uses data from this graph to support the researcher's conclusion? Okay, so once again, we're tasked to look for the conclusion in the text. Conservationists increasingly understand that small, isolated, or narrowly focused conservation programs may not be enough. So if a conservation program is narrowly focused, it's not enough. Meaning that if the effort to save endangered species or threatened species is narrowly focused, it wouldn't do no good. Okay, in fact, researchers recommend that the geographical scope of such activities be expanded to spread the protective effect over a wide area. So the researchers are claiming that the scope should be expanded to protect more animals. The researchers traveled to a region in Mexico's Colima state to examine conditions in the protected areas. Let's further examine the passage. The region is unique in its range of its climate and biodiversity. So it incorporates various range of climate. Biodiversity has to do with the number of species existing within the region, with sections that begin at sea level and rises to elevation above 2,000 meters, studying the region's protected areas and comparing them with currently unprotected areas. So we can expect to see areas that are protected and not protected in the data set. The researchers concluded, okay, so we found the word that we're looking for, that increasing the scope, and we've already read this before, right? Increasing the scope of protection would increase the number of species that can survive in those areas. So to simply put it, increasing the scope would increase the number of species. That's something that we need to isolate from the data set. Okay, so, it describes the right topic, number of species in protected and not protected areas. And the vertical axis describes the number of species. And we need to find something that increases the number of species or number of species that's more abundant than the other areas. So we're looking to support the claim to expand the scope of protection. And this is the only area that's not protected, whereas these 3 areas are all protected. And we also see some information that wasn't in the passage, which is the dividing up of the species: amphibians, mammals, endemic birds, reptiles, and threatened. And let's see how that plays out in the answer choice. Okay, A. Close to 400 species have died out in places that are not protected. So let's consider our original claim. Expanding the scope of protection will increase the number of species. Species dying out doesn't support anything. So should you go back to the data set to confirm whether if 400 species have died out? No, not really. Why? Because as you can see, the data set only describes the existing species and has no information regarding how many species died out. So answer choice A would not only be off topic when considering the data set, it also fails to describe the conclusion. Let's look at B. Protection had little effect on the survivability of amphibians and reptiles. Before you even identify whether if this is correct or not according to the data, having little effect. Expanding scope, increasing the number, has nothing to do with this description. So little effect, died out, they all fail to describe the conclusion of the passage. C. Every protected area, and this is promising because this has to do with expanding the scope. It incorporates all the protected areas, has a higher total number. Should we count the numbers? Well, we can see from the graph that the bar is generally higher for protected areas. So this confirms the data as well of the surviving species. So expanding scope, increasing the number of species, answer choice C describes it perfectly. Remember, it has to satisfy both the data and the conclusion in the text. What about D? Algae Bali has the greatest number of surviving species. Okay, so this is one area of the 4, and let's see what it says, what the data indicates about this specific region. Here it is, right? Does it have the highest surviving number of species? It seems so, because this bar is the highest. This bar seems higher than the rest. And before we examine the rest, I mean, when put together, this area actually may have the most number of species. Let's get back to the answer choice. So should this be the right answer? Algae Bali has the greatest number of surviving species. It's protected and it has the most number of species. But always remember the conclusion in the text. Expanding the scope increases the number of surviving species. So answer choice D does describe one area of the protected area, but it does nothing to address expanding scope, nor the total number of species that would increase by expanding the scope. So D answer choice fails to address expanding the scope. So although it describes the data correctly, it should be eliminated because it does not fully support the conclusion. So as with the last problem, we're seeing answer choices that pretty much describes the data correctly, but does little to support the conclusion or has an incomplete support of the conclusion. Okay.